Ladies and gentlemen, the Brit Pack is back. Simon Head and Shamakar Sandhu bringing you fighting talk from the British side of the pond. A distinctly British flavour is what we like to say on this show, and we'll give you that in spades on this week's show. Plenty of British MMA talk on this week's show. We talk about UFC Fight Night London. Interesting news coming out of UFC Fight Night London this week. We will talk about that. We have a main event, long awaited, and it's been met with a mixed response. We will talk about that later on in the show. We will also talk about Conor McGregor and his first foray into non-fighting pay-per-view. He did a sit-down interview with Ariel Helwani in Manchester, an experience with Conor McGregor. Our man Sandhu was there watching through the web link and will give us the rundown on that. And of course we will look back at UFC on Fox as Valentina Shevchenko ran out the winner against Juliana Pena and became the number one contender for the UFC Women's Bantamweight Championship. Sandhu, how are you, buddy?
Very sleep deprived, Simon. It's been a very busy 48 hours in the world of mixed martial arts. Like you mentioned, news coming out regarding the main event of UFC London. We had the UFC and Fox card on the weekend. Obviously, the Conor McGregor interview was fire. And we even had a chance to squeeze in some WWE pro wrestling with the Royal Rumble last night. And I know there's a fair section of our listeners and the general MMA community who are also pro wrestling fans. So I think it was a packed weekend for all parties concerned.
Yeah, I haven't quite caught up on sleep myself. I always look sleep deprived, but I actually am this time. So, but the first and most important thing, arguably on the list, is we had some live fights this weekend, and UFC on Fox came from where it all began for the UFC, Denver, Colorado. They packed out the Pepsi Center, over 13,000 fans, took to the stands for Valentina Shevchenko's coming out party. A lot of people, myself included, thought that Juliana Pena was going to get this one done, Sandhu. But Valentina Shevchenko showed that she is a hell of a lot more than just a very good striker. She submitted Juliana Pena in the second round, and she looked absolutely phenomenal. Great performance from Bullet, and now she's going to get back in there with Amanda Nunes for a rematch for the UFC Women's Bantamweight Championship. Great performance from Valentina Shevchenko.
Yeah, Simon. No one saw that coming. I certainly didn't. I was really impressed with Shevchenko earlier on this year, and that was the very first time I really paid close attention to her when she defeated Holly Holm. But this, I think, was really her coming out party. I thought she looked really good on her feet, and to take Juliana Pena down on the ground and defeat her in basically her own world there was fascinating. And I think now we're starting to see her really come into her own and showcase the skills of an all-round mixed martial artist. Great move by the UFC to have Amanda Nunes come into the octagon right after and have them both face off there. There was a bit of kind of speculation as to whether the winner of this would actually get the next title shot, because Amanda Nunes has been talking about potentially fighting the winner of Durandamy and Holly Holm for the 145 belt. That was firmly put to rest with her being brought into the cage and facing off with Shevchenko. They used to do that quite a lot back in the day. They haven't had two fights face off after the main event finishes for quite some time. So I thought that was a really good move. And the fact that the actual broadcast got over 2 million viewers, I think that sets them both up nicely to give them that extra exposure. And I think now moving forward, if they can portray and promote a well-balanced marketing campaign showcasing the storylines of both fighters, I think they'll both be in good shape for it whenever they do eventually fight.
Yeah, it was really interesting when they got them both in there. The trash talk was a little bit, I don't know, it just seemed a little bit awkward to me, some of it. It started out respectful, then Amanda Nunes decided to get a little bit aggressive, but I think it served its purpose, the fact that they got them in there, and sometimes you need to do that. But the thing that really struck me was the size differential. I watched the Amanda Nunes Valentina Shevchenko fight at UFC 196. That was last March in Las Vegas. That was the infamous night when Nate Diaz submitted Conor McGregor.
Yes.
And that fight, Amanda Nunes won it by unanimous decision. She won the first two rounds. She won the first round comfortably. Second round was quite close, but she did win it. but going down the stretch, it was Shevchenko who was by far the better fighter. And I remember turning to my colleagues on press row saying, if this was a 5-round fight, I'd be piling my money on Shevchenko at this point, because she was the one who was really piling on the pressure, and Nunes was beginning to tread water towards the end of that 3rd round. We're now going to see that fight again at 5 rounds. So I think it's going to be a fascinating contest. It might not be the big A-list matchup that some people might be looking for, but in terms of a quality matchup at 135 pounds, Amanda Nunes is probably the most destructive force in that division right now, and Valentina Shevchenko arguably is the most technical fighter in the entire division. And one of the things that we as journalists perhaps didn't pay enough mind to when we were going into that fight was just the amount of and breadth of skill within the combat sport realm that Valentina Shevchenko has got. She's got black belts and masters of sport in all manner of different disciplines. She's a 2nd Dan black belt in Taekwondo. She's an international master of sports in Muay Thai. She's a master of sports in boxing, kickboxing, Taekwondo and Judo. And she's also a black belt in Judo. And it's that I think perhaps got overlooked a little bit during the build-up to this fight. She knows what she's doing on the mat, a lot more than she's shown leading into this particular fight. But boy, did she show it on Saturday night. Great performance from Valentina Shevchenko.
And she can dance.
She can dance as well. She's got some moves. I certainly can't dance. So I've got no grounds for critiquing other people's dance moves. But she's certainly got some moves. It's kind of cool to see her showing a bit more personality. It's always good when people get to learn a little bit more about the fighter. She communicates and expresses herself really well. Obviously, English is not her first language, but dealing with the post-fight interviews and the press conferences, no problems whatsoever on that front. So it just serves to help build the fight, and she's more than capable of holding her own verbally and physically with someone like Amanda Nunes, and I think that's going to be a fascinating matchup. We may well see that sort of international fight week time. It's sort of, the time frame would seem to fit quite nicely for that. What happens with Juliana Pena from here?
That's a very good question, Si. The first thought that came straight to mind is a Ronda Rousey match. Ronda Rousey has gone on Instagram post the loss to Amanda Nunes, basically saying, I'm rock bottom, I'm starting from scratch type of thing. And I think what Ronda Rousey needs is a match that will be stylistically quite I don't want to say easy, but what's the kind of word and the verbiage I'm looking for? A style that she can get to grips with, right? Juliana Pena's style is very much grappling based, and I think Ronda Rousey would match up very, very well with her. What she'd also get with Juliana Pena is a great dance partner when it comes to promoting the fight. We already have learned that even though it's on a Friday and even though she was coming off a loss, Ronda Rousey is still one of the biggest draws in the sport. She can definitely pull in the attendance and the pay-per-view numbers. She can do all that business. And I think if she wants to stay in the fight game, a fight with Juliana Pena would make the world of sense, and they've obviously got the history going back to when Ronda Rousey and Miesha Tate, were served as coaches on The Ultimate Fighter. That was the same season that Juliana Pena won. So there's lots to work with there. So that's my and of course on Pena's side, to stay at the top of the division, a win over Rousey would still warrant perhaps a future title shot, a big marquee win over a signature fight like that on a massive pay-per-view. So she'd be right up in the mix to perhaps fight the winner of Amanda Nunes and Valentina Shevchenko.
You want to know what else it does? I can't imagine Ronda Rousey fighting on a UFC event and it not being a main event of a pay-per-view at this point. I know before they used to kind of prop her up a little bit by making her co-main to a male title fight. She's gone beyond that, even though she's lost. She's such a huge draw. The UFC could conceivably do a Ronda Rousey Juliana Pena pay-per-view, even though there's no championship on the line. I know it kind of goes against the sort of the unwritten rule that you have to have a belt. They have done it without belts before. Anderson Silva, I remember, headlined a pay-per-view in a non-title fight. Conor McGregor has headlined a pay-per-view in a non-title fight. So it can be done, and that, if anything, gives the UFC added flexibility in their booking. It means that they don't necessarily have to put a world championship fight in there through necessity's sake, if that makes sense. You can do Ronda Rousey versus Juliana Pena. Something they could maybe consider, is something that's never been done before, and it would be kind of a cool thing to try, would be to do an all-female fight card. And you could have Rousey and Pena headlining, but you could do an all-female fight card, and I think you could really put the WME marketing machine behind that, and that could become something really, really quite something. And I think it would just highlight the depth of talent that the UFC has in the women's weight divisions. Obviously, they're looking to build a third weight class as well now, and we can maybe use that event to try and bolster that up as well. I think that would be something that I would certainly consider. That might be a little bit different, and it allows you to market it in a slightly different way, whereby people don't necessarily feel like they're being shortchanged by not having a world championship fight on the card. I don't know. It's just an idea that literally sprung to me as we were talking about it. But I would be interested in a Juliana Pena Ronda Rousey fight. I don't know what other fights are out there for Ronda other than people she's already fought before. They could bring Misha back for one more, perhaps. But Holly Holm's obviously fighting for a world championship, so she's out of the equation. Amanda Nunes destroyed her, so she's out of the equation. Juliana Pena, there is an existing sort of niggling rivalry there between them. It makes all the sense in the world. I think that would be a great fight to make. What was also a great fight while it lasted was the co-main event in Denver, Colorado. Jorge Masvidal picking out arguably the biggest win of his UFC career, TKOing Donald Cowboy Cerrone a minute into the second round. Now, this was a controversial fight, not because of the result. Jorge Masvidal clearly deservedly the winner of that fight, but the fact that it was allowed to go into the second round. Herb Dean, from my vantage point and watching it live, I thought he'd stopped the fight. I thought he stopped it a little bit before the buzzer. They since ran back the footage to double check, and sure enough, he stepped in about a second before the buzzer. And it looked to me as if he was kind of hedging his bets a little bit. Dana White gave him a bit of an excuse, a bit of a get out in the press conference, saying that it was ridiculously loud in there at the time, and he didn't necessarily hear the buzzer clearly himself. So it gives Herb a little bit of a pass. But Cerrone looked done at the end of that round. He looked out, and it was slightly surprising that the corner sent him back out there. It was also surprising that the doctors didn't stop the fight, because he'd clearly been knocked out at the end of that. And he went back out there. He gamely tried to stay in there, and it was a fait accompli at that point. Jorge Masvidal just took him apart. Another 60 seconds of needless punishment, really, and Masvidal moves forward in the welterweight division. First off, talk to us about how you saw that incident, and then tell us about how impressed you were with game-bred Masvidal, because he seriously impressed me on Fight Night.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. I saw it the same way you did. I thought that Herb Dean had stopped the fight, and then there was a little bit of controversy there. It's a difficult one, right? Because you've got a minute to kind of gather your senses and regain your composure. Now, should it be down to the cornermen to have a look at their fight and say, right, this guy's knocked out, we should be throwing in the towel, and I think that should be talked about more. Cornermen throwing in towels, protecting their fighters. This was a big one for Cowboy Cerrone. It was his fifth fight at welterweight within 12 months. He obviously done a phenomenal job in 2016, was one of the fighters of the year. It was one of the comeback stories of the year, given how one-sided he lost to Rafael dos Anjos in that title fight at the back end of 2015. It was his fifth fight in 12 months at welterweight, but more importantly, it was in his backyard. It was in Denver, Colorado. He's been wanting an opportunity to fight in Denver for a very, very long time. Finally got it. And there was a lot of talk of him potentially, if things went in his way, potentially skipping over Damian Maia Again, going back to the whole idea of WME IMG, looking for the big signature marquee fighters, guys have got big fan followings and are very marketable, and giving them the push and giving them these title shots and these big opportunities. There was a lot of talk of him potentially going right to the front of the queue. He was already ranked number 5, but take absolutely nothing away from Jorge Masvidal. Truly, a highlight performance out of him. The best of his career. He's never looked better. And there's lots of talk now of him potentially leapfrogging a lot of people. He was ranked 12 coming into the fight. I'm sure he'll be firmly cracking into the top 10 in the official UFC rankings. And there was a lot of chatter online of him potentially fighting a Robbie Lawler or a Nick Diaz. And to be honest with you, if one of those comes to fruition, that gets my mouth watering. That gets me rubbing my hands. I mean, he's an action fighter. He's an exciting fighter. I thought he did really well in his post-fight interview. He just kind of almost walked away, said what he had to say, called out Dana White. He wants big fights. He wants the big money opportunities. And I think he's going to get them off that performance.
Yeah, I think he bet Dana White $200,000 that he couldn't find a guy in the welterweight division to beat him. And when he's on form like that, he is as good as anybody. And the thing that, and Dana referenced it in the press conference, he said he doesn't pull the trigger in fights. And I don't know whether that's the case, but the thing that I've always sort of leveled against him is whenever I've watched him in fights where he has been, from a technical standpoint, head and shoulders above the guy standing opposite him. And he's just lighting them up without ever really putting them away. So he's pulling the trigger, but he's doing enough. But then when the pace needs to be up to gear in order to sort of match the guy as he comes back, he sometimes doesn't quite find the pedal, And the last 3 fights he's done the business. He went the distance with Ross Pearson. He stopped Jake Ellenberger, and then obviously he's just stopped Donald Cowboy Cerrone. And Ellenberger and Cerrone are kind of mainstays of the UFC, who in whatever weight division they're operating in, they're always there or thereabouts. Maybe not necessarily right up there in championship contention, but certainly not that far away. And he's put both of them away by stoppage. I think the time is right to give him a push. The fight I would love to see is the Nick Diaz fight. I think from a stylistic point of view, they're absolutely made for each other. I think it would be a really fascinating matchup, and both of them are very interesting characters. I think the build up to the fight would be kind of cool as well, and they would be the perfect co-main event for a world title fight further down the line, I think, stylistically. But I wouldn't hate on the Robbie Lawler fight either. I don't know when Robbie Lawler's going to be ready to return, but when he does, he's going to want someone relevant in that UFC welterweight division. And maybe someone who's on a bit of a charge right now would be a good pick for him. So I think the options are out there for Masvidal. And but yeah, the Diaz fight for me, it kind of makes sense. Masvidal's breaking into the upper echelons of that division. Diaz is returning and needs to establish himself. And I think the winner of that can then go forward and maybe fight for a number 1 contender spot later in the year. But I think that would be absolutely outstanding. Great performance from Jorge Masvidal, but perhaps almost eclipsing him. As good as Masvidal was, for me, the one person who at least I came away talking about the most is the big, scary Francis Ngannou, who just put Andre Arlovski away like he was just like he was some overmatched prospect. It just put him away so easily. And obviously Arlovski's been around this sport for such a long time. He's been stopped a lot in his recent career, and his punch resistance maybe isn't quite what it once was. But boy, did Ngannou look dangerous in that fight. And we've seen his body of work just start to build. And now what we have on our hands is arguably the scariest man in the UFC. I know Derek Lewis probably can lay claim to that. Anthony Rumble Johnson can certainly lay claim to that. For me, Francis Ngannou has a bit of the Rumble Johnsons about him, but he's just bigger and scarier, and if possible, hits even harder. I'm fascinated to see what they're going to do with him next. I had hopes that they might put him on the London card. We will talk about that a little bit later on. But I don't envy the next person to step through the door of the octagon to stand opposite Francis Ngannou, because that's a terrifying human being.
You know what's amazing about Francis Ngannou is and what gets me so excited about his future and his potential future, he's yet another European. He's yet another European who could potentially become a UFC world champion within the next year to 18 months. It would be fantastic originally from Cameroon, but he did emigrate to France when he was a kid. And MMA is still banned and illegal in France, which is amazing, considering they could have the baddest man on the planet on their hands in the next year and a half. He's certainly acting like the baddest man on the planet, that's for sure. Absolutely scary. I still think he's a little rough around the edges, and that'll come in time. He'll start to get polished the more time he puts into the gym and the more fights he gets under his belt. But he's certainly on his way. Dana White is high on him. I've literally every other tweet from the European UFC Twitter handle seems to be about Francis Ngannou. So they're definitely giving him a massive promotional push on this side of the world. The fact that he can speak English and conduct his own interview, I think for the most part English, that's a big plus, especially to get his personality across into the North American market. To be honest with you, even if he was a mute, I don't think he'd have to do too much anyway, to be honest with you, because he is an absolutely scary, scary human being, and he's an action fighter. When he delivered that uppercut to Andrei Arlovski, I just, I felt it here in London. So I'm really excited to see what they do next with him. I also, like yourself, did think that, considering he didn't take too much damage, could there be a sneaky chance of him getting fast-tracked and getting him put onto the London card? And that might still be the case. There are still a few slots to fill, I believe, for the London card. I think it's a 10 or 11 fight card at the moment. So you never know. But the heavyweight division needs fighters like Francis Ngannou, like Derek Lewis, who over the course of the last year to 18 months, these guys have started to break through. They're young in comparison to what the average age of a UFC heavyweight is. They're fan favorites, the action fighters. And the future looks bright.
Yeah, I think it was the post-fight press conference. Dana said that obviously, we've seen a lot of heavyweights and a lot of heavyweight champions in the UFC, but he said this might be the first one, or potentially the first guy who looks the way he does. He's got that. He's just got that. He cuts that imposing figure. He's absolutely ripped. He hits like a truck. He's got the the scary demeanor about him. And he's just got. I hesitate to use the phrase Mike Tyson-esque, but they've got that sort of air of just destruction about them, and Francis Ngannou certainly has that in spades. Put away Andrei Arlovski in devastating fashion. Other people have done the same with Andrei Arlovski, so the big test will come in Francis Ngannou's next fight. Looking at the potential permutations for him, particularly if you're going to turn him around in the next couple or 3 months, the highest ranked guy you could realistically see him in there is probably Ben Rothwell, who is available. I think he's coming back from an injury layoff himself. He'll be looking for a fight, and as someone pointed out to me on Twitter, Ben Rothwell's bio says, "I get paid to end monsters." Well, the biggest monster in the UFC heavyweight division goes by the name of Francis Ngannou, and I'd love to see those two match up, and I would have loved to have seen it on the London card. Maybe we can still see that, who knows. That'd be certainly a juicy co-main event to slap on that UFC London card and cheer up some of the British fans. But great performance from him. And the last fight we'll talk about is the fight that opened up the main card. Jason Knight, a guy who not many people will have heard of 12 months ago. He's on a real tear in the UFC, and he's becoming a bit of a character. He defeated Alex Caceres by rear naked choke. Really impressive performance from the lad who goes by the unofficial nickname. He's Jason the Kid Knight. That's his actual nickname, but he also is known to the media as Hick Diaz. He's a good old Southern boy. Likes to trash talk people mid fight, and he put a great performance in on Saturday night. He called out Doo Ho Choi, Sandhu. That for me is just straight fire, as the kids like to say these days. That would be a fantastic matchup. What do you reckon?
Yeah, sign me up to that. To be honest with you, Jason Knight has really flown under my radar. I haven't paid too much attention to him, and to be honest with you, when I saw the fight card, I thought, oh, they've made a bit of a mistake here. You've got Rafael Assunção versus Aljamain Sterling on the prelims. Why isn't that on the main card? Because the bantamweight division could always have contenders coming up, and giving those guys exposure is just a very good thing to do for that particular weight class. Obviously, hindsight being 2020, I think eventually the right move was made by the UFC, because Jason Knight put on a fantastic performance, and it's interesting because he is now a free agent. So that was the last fight on his current UFC contract, and he's not quiet about it. He's openly said that he wants to renegotiate, he wants to re-sign with the UFC, but they need to pay up. So he's bet on himself. He didn't re-sign a new contract before this fight. It was a big platform on Fox. Again, I'd like to say 2 million viewers, and he put on the best performance of his career so far. And I thought just generally his post-fight interview, his demeanor, I think he came across really, really well to our little MMA community. So I expect big things of Jason Knight down the road, and I'm sure the UFC will re-up him.
Yeah, he's had a tough introduction to the UFC when he joined back in December 2015. He lost the decision to Tatsuya Karajiri, but since then he's gone on a tear. He beat former Cage Warriors champion Jim Allers by split decision. Then he took on Dan Hooker, who is a good fighter at 145 pounds. Beat him by unanimous decision, and now he's picked up his first inside the distance win in the UFC, beating Alex Caceres. Looking forward to see where they go with him from now. First of all, they've got to sort his contracts out, but he's an interesting character. He's not someone he's not chasing money, and he's not chasing money fights. I think he just wants his contract sorted, and he wants fights with people who are going to test him. I thought his post-fight interview was great. He said, "I don't want easy fights. I want to fight someone who I know can beat me, so that I can beat them." And I thought that was really a really good way of going about things. And Doo Ho Choi versus Jason Knight would be a fantastic matchup. That was UFC on Fox 23 from Denver, Colorado. And but what we want to look at now is something that happened outside the octagon. The biggest star in the sport, Conor McGregor, may not have been fighting this weekend, but it wasn't a weekend off for the Notorious One, because he was right here in Britain, in Manchester, England, no less, for an experience with Conor McGregor, a sit-down, a fireside chat, as they like to call these things. Just a little cosy, intimate fireside chat with Ariel Helwani and 5,000 of his closest friends who had purchased tickets for the event. It was available to watch online as a pay-per-view. I think it cost $4.99 here in the UK. One of the people who paid the $4.99 and watched it was your good self, Mr. Sandhu. Now, I hold my hands up. I did not watch this. I was watching the early prelims from Denver, so I didn't watch the actual interview. I've seen a lot of the fallout from it, and I was watching your excellent Twitter play-by-play. But talk us through some of the key highlights and the setup. I'm interested to know, first off, was it good value for money for the people who went? Was it good value for money for the people who stumped up to watch it on the stream?
See, I'm not too sure. I mean, I'm aware of the company that organised this, because I've done this in the past with Al Pacino and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I also believe maybe Mike Tyson as well. And I suppose it just depends on, as a fan, who you idolise, and if it's an opportunity to get up close and personal and have some sort of interaction in a private, intimate setting like it was with somebody you look up to and respect and are a fan of. So I suppose for a lot of people, perhaps for them, it was an opportunity to do that with Conor McGregor. I don't know if he was able to meet and greet all 5,000 or what the setup was. I know there was a tiered system of tickets, which ranged from, I think, £50 to £100 all the way up to the thousands. depending on what kind of package you bought. But it was a very interesting setup because it is the first time I've ever heard of an interview being streamed via an iPay-per-view format. I think it cost £3.99. I think it was $5 US. I think that's how the exchange rate worked out. I mean, for me, I had no qualms in paying it because that's where the news is. He's a polarizing figure in our sport. He's the biggest star in our sport, and I just provided a live play-by-play on Twitter, which everyone appreciated from my following. There were a lot of people either couldn't watch it because they were out and about, or even though it only costs a little bit more than a cup of coffee these days, there are some people out there that perhaps can't afford it. Right. And actually, there were some people that were able to access it. I think New Zealand, Australia, and a few other countries were blacked out. So even if they wanted to pay for it, they couldn't. So it was almost like, in a way, providing a service to some fans who didn't have access to actually to watch the live stream, even if they wanted to. That all being put to one side, I thought, first of all, Ariel Helwani did a decent job. I think. If you didn't know it was a pay-per-view, it would have been just another interview of Ariel Helwani's on the MMA Hour, right? He is one of the, if not the best interviewer in our little sport here, and he's got the relationship and the rapport with Conor McGregor. I think out of everyone that could have interviewed Conor McGregor, Helwani was probably the best person for the job, just so that he could ask all the hard questions. And maybe get more out of McGregor than maybe somebody else would have that maybe isn't from our MMA bubble. So I think the experience with guys did a good job of tapping him up and getting him on board. In regards to the actual meat on the bones, in regards to what Conor McGregor said, he addressed everything that I think people have been wanting to either hear him talk about or would be interested in hearing his take on, from Floyd Mayweather to Nate Diaz to the UFC to Hollywood to the WWE. To a potential boxing career, to how things are going since he won the lightweight championship in New York. So a lot to digest, but I think the main takeaway is still everything surrounding a potential fight, a crossover fight with Floyd Mayweather. That's the main kind of takeaway that I think everyone's talking about from the interview. Essentially, with regards of whatever is on the table at the UFC, whether it's a trilogy fight with Nate Diaz, whether it's to fight the winner of Ferguson and Khabib Nurmagomedov for the lightweight championship, whether it's a return to featherweight, which he didn't rule out. He said that people are talking about him not returning back to featherweight, but he could make featherweight no problem. So he didn't rule that out either. He talked a little bit about going up to welterweight and challenging for the 170-pound championship. But he said that all essentially pales in comparison to what he potentially has the opportunity to do at the moment. That is fight Floyd Mayweather. That's what everybody wants. It's where he will make the most money. He said that he'd like to have the UFC on board to make everything a little bit smoother. But he also said he's going to be going to Las Vegas very, very soon to speak to the Nevada State Athletic Commission. Now, he said that he's going to go there to, first of all, handle the $150,000 fine that he still has to pay for his role in the bottle throwing incident going back to UFC 202 last August. But it's also about obtaining a boxer's license. And he did, mention the Ali Act, which would cause a little bit of legal issues. I'm sure that he would have to potentially go to court if he was to lean on the Ali Act to try and get a boxing fight put together with Floyd Mayweather without the UFC. But like you said, Simon, even before the interview kicked off, he had this amazing post on Instagram where he was basically saying, F the UFC, F the WWE, F boxing, F Floyd Mayweather. I've got this pay-per-view interview. People are paying to watch, and there's 5,000 people in attendance to watch him, speak for an hour. So it's amazing. He is such a polarizing character, such a polarizing figure. That people will pay attention, and evidently people will either pay for the privilege to see him or hear him talk in person, or pay for it online. I know you didn't pay, I know you didn't watch it live yourself, but I know you've seen some of the key quotes that have come out and the articles that have been written. What's been your take on some of the key takeaways, that the likes of our MMA community has been talking about in the 48 hours that have passed since the interview?
I'll be honest with you, I think the biggest takeaways came not from what Conor McGregor said, but from two other protagonists within this whole soap opera. It's all about what they said. I thought it was very interesting how Dana White responded during the post-fight press conference. I also thought it was very interesting what happened with Floyd Mayweather, who turned up at a boxing event that he had absolutely nothing to do with, proceeded to do on-camera live television interviews with virtually every live broadcaster in the room, and told each of them that he thinks the Conor McGregor fight will happen. So that I thought was very interesting. But in terms of what was being said, and I've seen some of the articles, and obviously I was watching your play-by-play. It sounded to me like it was just reeling off sound bites, almost as some sort of crowd-pleasing thing. 1 minute he's saying, "I'll take on Tyron Woodley, I'll beat him," and then the next thing he's saying, "I'll take on Nate Diaz and I'll beat him." It's like he's got a line for every actuality, every eventuality. But if we leave the Mayweather thing to one side for a second, because that has a life of its own at this point. He's the UFC lightweight champion of the world. He's contracted to the UFC. The Mayweather thing needs to be contractually agreed, and there's an awful lot of things and an awful lot of moving parts that are going to need to be brought together in order for that fight to happen. And it looks more likely now than it ever had before. But there's still an awful long way to go before that ever comes together. What we do know is he's the reigning UFC lightweight champion. We also know he's contracted to the UFC. We also know that he's taking time out because he's about to become a father for the first time. What I wanted to know from this was, who is he going to defend his title against? Because the thing that worries me is that through all of this, and I completely understand why he might want to be pursuing this Floyd Mayweather fight, is the UFC and the sport of mixed martial arts at the highest level is effectively being sidelined while McGregor goes off on this jaunt towards a fight with Floyd Mayweather. And for me, there are echoes of the Nate Diaz rematch in this. Obviously, there are different circumstances surrounding it. He fought Diaz on short notice, lost, and rather than go back to trying to defend his title, he needed to go and face Diaz again, and he effectively deviated from the path of sort of the established order of what happens in a meritocratic sport to go off and do that. And then he obviously from that went on and challenged for the lightweight title, and we know what happened after that. He lost his featherweight belt. So he's now got one belt, and we're no closer to knowing A, if he's going to defend it, and B, when he's going to defend it, and C, who he's going to defend it against. And for me, they're the three big questions that, as a mixed martial arts journalist, that I want to know answers to. And he was throwing names out left, right, and centre from what I could make out from social media during the event, and it was almost as if he was throwing these names out just for the sake of throwing them out there. Keep all the different pots boiling, all the different plates spinning, without committing to any of them. And some people would say that's a master at work. He's being very clever, and he absolutely is. He absolutely is. But there comes a point where he does have to fight again, and I've got no issue with him taking the time out. I don't think anybody would begrudge him. Even if he wasn't going to be a father, I think the guy deserves a rest. He's had an incredible 2 years. He's stepped up whenever he's been asked to step up. He's taken fights. He's taken fights that he wasn't originally booked to take, but took them anyway on short notice. And they haven't all gone his way, but he's taken them, and he's gone through and he's conducted himself within sort of the smaller bubble of MMA competition flawlessly. I don't think you can criticise the way he's gone about his business as a competitive sportsman. It's all of the fluff that is around the outside. We're getting far more sizzle than we're getting steak now, and I want a bit more steak, and I want to see McGregor fight, and I want to see him fight in the octagon, and I want to see him fight Khabib Nurmagomedov or Tony Ferguson, and if he beats them, I'll quite fancy seeing him fight against Tyron Woodley, if indeed Tyron Woodley still has the belt. I would also like to see him fight Jose Aldo again one day. But the Mayweather fight, I can take or leave. I understand why he wants to go for it. It's basically his retirement. If he could retire comfortably now, but if he gets this Mayweather fight, then him, his family, and generations of his family are probably going to be made. And it would be, if that fight's on the table, he'd be mad not to take it, just from a financial standpoint. But as a sports journalist, I want to see the guy competing. And I want to see him competing at the highest level in his sport, and his sport is mixed martial arts. He has a world championship belt. I think he has a duty to defend it. I'm not saying he has to defend it now, but I think by the time we get to International Fight Week in the summer, I think we either need to know that he's going to be fighting during International Fight Week, or we need to know that he's going to be fighting very soon afterwards. Otherwise, we're then going to get back round to the situation that we had with the featherweight belt, where we're saying, well, is he going to defend this belt? Are they going to have to think about taking that belt off him? And then it's history repeating itself. It's championship belt Groundhog Day, and that's my worry, because while I have no problem with him chasing this huge fight, I also want him to stay within the sport that made him who he is. Colleague of ours, John Morgan, mentioned that he nearly missed the flight for his UFC debut because he was signing on at the Dole office, and he nearly missed his flight. And now here he is, the biggest draw in the UFC ever, and he's on the verge of landing this ridiculous super fight for astronomical sums of money with Floyd Mayweather in a sport that he has never professionally competed in before. It's a remarkable rise in fortunes for him, but I don't want to see the UFC and mixed martial arts sidelined by this. I want to see him competing. I want to see him defending that championship. He's a superstar. He hasn't defended a championship belt yet. That's what I want to see. And he gave us a lot of sound bites, and he's marketed himself in a way that no fighter ever has. But when push comes to shove, the thing that really pays the bills is when you step in and fight. And right now, I don't know quite what the path is for him. And I'd hoped that through the interviews we might have learnt a little bit more about it. But actually, all it's done is raise more questions. And that leaves me a little disappointed. I understand why he's done it. He's a shrewd businessman. But I just want to see Conor McGregor in the octagon against Sandhu. That's it. It's not because I want to see him lose, because actually I like seeing him succeed. I think it's great for the sport when he wins. But I also want to see him tested. I want to see him fight the best of the best in the hardest combat sport on the planet, mixed martial arts. And right now, we seem further away from that than ever. And that's what I want to see put right towards the back end of this year.
So let me ask you, on January 30th, 2017, is the next fight for Conor McGregor against Floyd Mayweather, or is it against somebody in the UFC?
I really hope it's someone in the UFC, because I think the length of time that it's going to take to get the Mayweather fight done, I don't think we'll see it this side of 2018. I think the earliest we can realistically expect to see it is November, December time, and that's being optimistic. I can't see it being done in time for the summer. And I also don't... And also McGregor's going to need to train. And he's going to have to train exclusively boxing. He's going to need a full training camp if he's going to get in there with Floyd Mayweather. So he's going to need some serious prep time. And I can't see the fight happening until the end of the year at the earliest, if not into 2018. Now, if his focus is all on that, does that mean we're going to go a calendar year without seeing him fight? And that's why I'm worried about the whole world champion having to lose his belt again thing. If he wasn't a world champion, I would actually be less concerned about this, or less worried about it. It's the fact that he's a standard bearer for the sport. He has a duty to defend his world champion, his world championship, and I just think there's a certain amount of responsibility there that I hope he isn't sort of running away from isn't the right terminology, isn't neglecting or turning his back on. So I really do hope that we get to see him fight at least once, hopefully twice, before the end of 2017 in the UFC, because I don't think he's going to fight Mayweather until 2018, if at all.
Well, one of the key lines in his interview was, the next time, this is a direct quote, the next time you see me in a combat sports arena, you'll see me walk through boxing rings. And that's a pretty definitive statement that he said there. Again, like you said, a lot of moving parts to that particular fight. Obviously, Dana White's come out and said, he's got a better chance of playing for the New England Patriots in the Super Bowl final this upcoming Sunday. But that's all in front of the cameras. Who really knows what's going on behind the scenes? Of course, the UFC aren't going to just let him walk away for a boxing fight unless they can get a piece of the pie. They are having a bit of a transitional period at the moment where a lot of the biggest draws and stars aren't available. They are still gearing towards this target of trying to generate as much revenue by the summer. They've also got this massive TV deal that needs to be re-upped at the end of this year, or the negotiations start as well. So there's just so much happening with WME owned UFC. But if I'm a betting man, I think he is going to do exactly what you fear, Simon. I think he will take a year out. I think he will be fighting Floyd Mayweather next. I think it won't be good for the UFC lightweight and featherweight divisions. And I think that you said he needs a full training camp. I would hazard to guess that he is training boxing exclusively just right now. And he may need to do that for an entire year to give himself a fighter's chance, or a fighting chance, against an all-time great defensive counter-striker of a boxer in Floyd Mayweather. Floyd is approaching 40. I know he's had problems with his hands, especially towards the latter part of his career. And I think what they learned with the Manny Pacquiao fight is, I think perhaps a North American audience won't be fooled again. A lot of people wanted the Pacquiao fight to happen, and it should have happened 5 years sooner. It ended up being a dud. But I think, if anything, what UFC 196 taught us was, if you can jump on the hype train, turn things around as quickly as humanly possible. And I'm not saying they're going to do this in 11 days like UFC 196. What I am saying is, I don't think they're going to let this linger for 2 or 3 or 4 years and perhaps risk McGregor losing in the UFC, which can easily happen. This is mixed martial arts we're talking about. He lost last year, and it's not going to end his career. But right now, his star couldn't be higher. It really couldn't be higher. He's coming off the biggest year of his career. He's still claiming himself to be a two-weight champion, right? And I think if he wants to take that momentum with him, especially from a promotional angle, and try and sell his ability or his belief that he can beat Floyd Mayweather to the casual fan base or casual viewers, who perhaps are none the wiser, who perhaps are just seeing a mixed martial artist who has got the majority of his wins by knockout, who is in his prime, who's 27, 28 years old, take on an aged veteran, all-time great boxer, and you've got, two parts of the world colliding, America, Ireland. You've got guys that have actually promoted themselves in, more ways that are similar than not with regards to how they flash their money. I think it would be fascinating. It would be just the ratings just on any piece of content, interviews, posters, you name it. There's already so much content out there in the last 6 months of this fight being talked about. And I think it's slowly just starting to ramp up and ramp up and ramp up. So if I'm a betting man, I think Mayweather McGregor does happen. It's not going to be ideal for the UFC's lightweight and featherweight division. It's not going to be ideal for fans that want to see McGregor defend his belt. It's not going to be ideal for fans who want to see McGregor fight in the octagon. I may be wrong, but I wasn't too keen on this fight happening. I was kind of just thinking, oh, this is just BS, and I'm not really buying into it. I'm all in. I think it's going to happen, and like you said, Simon, there's just far too much money on the table to potentially to take for McGregor. It's money he can't turn a blind eye to, and he did mention one other thing, that you've got Mayweather Promotions, you've got the UFC, and now you've got McGregor Promotions. So how they divvy up the numbers and the potential revenue that this fight could generate. He did say that, in his opinion, this would be the first $1 billion fight. And to be honest with you, with regards to everything else he said over his career that's come through to fruition, I wouldn't put it past him. Who knows? Could it break the Manny Pacquiao Mayweather box office record? Why not? If anyone can do it, it's McGregor Mayweather. So, I think there's still going to be so much to unpack over the coming weeks and months. And I'm sure you and me will be talking about this and debating and, dissecting so many more storylines and interviews, and it's probably going to end up being one of these stories of 2017. But for now, that was the interview. That was the key takeaway, and we'll see where Mayweather McGregor ends up in the coming year.
Yeah, it's going to be one of these that's going to run and run and run. There's going to be stories about it every week, and a lot of it is just going to be puff stuff. It's not that I don't think we're going to get that much in the way of new detail for weeks at a time, and then we'll get a little nugget of information from Mayweather. One of the people I would like to hear from is Leonard Ellerby. He's the CEO of Mayweather Promotions. He's Floyd Mayweather's most trusted business partner and advisor, and I would be fascinated to hear more from him. I'd also be very interested to hear more, or hear anything, from the senior management of WME. One of the things that comes into this is the UFC or WME have got some aggressive targets to hit. And if Conor McGregor's not going to be fighting in the UFC, then the UFC cannot afford not to be part of this event, because they're just leaving money on the table if they do. And they, from being the party that's in power, if you like, they're the ones who are going to have to sort of scrape and fight their way into this, because if McGregor's talking alley act and stuff like this in order to free him up from a contractual standpoint to face Mayweather, then what that does, Mayweather is he likes to call himself the A side and McGregor's the B side. Well, if he's the A side and the B side, then the UFC are sort of below that, and because they need to be a part of this, because if they're not, they're going to lose their biggest draw for minimum 12 months. They've already lost him for 6, so they don't want to lose him for the back end of the year as well. But if they know that towards the end of the year or early in 2018, they're going to co-promote this enormous event, which may be a co-branded boxing / UFC event. We've seen Bellator do it with Dynamite, where you had a kickboxing ring and a cage in the arena. That could happen. Why not do that? Put some boxing matches on, put some mixed martial arts matches on, acts as a nice showcase for both sports to both sets of fans, and obviously then you finish up with the big super fight inside the boxing ring. But the UFC absolutely needs to be a part of this if it's going to happen. Otherwise, they're going to be on the outside looking in. Their golden goose is going to be laying all these eggs, but someone else is going to be walking off with them. So that I think is going to be the biggest thing that needs to get ironed out one way or another. What you said about McGregor not fighting before he fights Mayweather makes complete sense, because I was talking about I want to see him tested. I want to see him fight the best. And in doing so, there's an inherent risk in that. People have said that Khabib Nurmagomedov is the most dangerous threat to Conor McGregor. that we've seen in the UFC. And there is a realistic chance that Khabib could beat Conor McGregor. And if he does beat Conor McGregor before McGregor gets to fight Mayweather, all of a sudden a lot of that mystique disappears. Yes, McGregor lost, but he instantly rematched Nate Diaz and beat him. So he was able to sort of save that a little bit. But to lose another one, and if you're going to lose to Khabib, you're probably going to lose in pretty devastating fashion, just, because of the way he fights. So that's not going to be a good look for someone who then wants to step in for a multi-million-dollar boxing match. And that's what worries me, as I say, to put your best guy on the shelf or allow your best guy to take himself out of the equation when you really need to be recouping some money because you bought the UFC for over $4 billion. That's why the UFC absolutely has to be at the table when they negotiate this fight and has to be part of the people taking a slice of the pie. Mayweather will undoubtedly take the lion's share. McGregor will take a sizable chunk himself. And the UFC are going to want their slice as well. And it's how all of that gets chopped up that I think is going to be the big talking point behind the scenes between now and any potential fight. But we're going to hear loads about it from now until then. If it even happens, who knows? But if I was a betting man right now, I don't think we're going to see Conor McGregor in the octagon in 2017. I want to. I don't think we will, based on what we're getting. So we'll look forward to learning more about it as the year goes on, and that will, as you say, be one of the biggest stories of the year. A story a little bit closer to home. Obviously, Conor McGregor was in Manchester, England, doing that press conference. The UFC are coming to England in March the 18th. UFC Fight Night London takes place at the O2 Arena in London's Docklands, and we now have a main event, Sandhu. And from the reaction that I've had on my Twitter timeline, the fans aren't that impressed with it. Jimmy the Poster Boy Manoa was announced to fight Corey Anderson 2 weeks ago, and there was certainly no mention of that fight being a main event fight. So one can only assume that something has happened, and the UFC have called an audible and have promoted Manoa Anderson to the main. I know Jimmy told some colleagues of ours in the media that his contract was for a 3-round fight. Corey Anderson last night tweeted saying, "Big news coming." It was pretty obvious what that would have been. And then a few minutes later, Mike Bond of MMA Junkie was able to get the confirmation from a UFC official that Jimmy and Corey is now the confirmed main event for UFC Fight Night London. What do you make of the fact that it's now the main event? And what do you think the overall reaction will be? Because obviously a lot of people will have bought tickets knowing the fighters that were on the card, but also with the expectation that there's no main event been announced. Therefore, something better than the names on the card would be on its way. That hasn't happened. So, what's your take on it?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because it's actually a story I've been following very well. I guess we both have very closely over the last couple of weeks. And it's interesting. A few weeks ago, I think you and me were both in mutual agreement that the fight we were expecting was going to be some sort of combination of either Gegard Mousasi versus Chris Weidman or Gegard Mousasi versus Luke Rockhold. Mousasi Weidman got booked for UFC 210 in Buffalo, New York. And the minute Mousasi, who I think has pretty much, outside of Michael Bisping and outside of any of the European champions, he's been the big European star over the last 12 months for the UFC. And we've spoken about how much the UFC London team loves working with him, and he's good for the European scene, and he's really kind of come into his own. And then when that fight got announced, I was like, wow, they're not going to use Mousasi in London. Now that's a head scratcher. Well, automatically my head was like, right, okay, well, they've got to go to Gustafsson. He's the logical next person. He was supposed to fight at the back end of 2016 in Brazil against Shogun Rua, I believe it was. Nogueira, I can't remember. It was one of those guys. But he pulled out due to injury. And I thought, well, okay, maybe he's healed in time, and London makes sense. It's close to home. A lot of Swedish fans would fly over to watch him fight here in London. He's fought in the O2 Arena before. He beat Jimmy Manuwa a couple of years back in the main event, and to get a main event fight would be great for Gustafsson. Just to kind of get back into the top spot, into the limelight again. And then I started thinking, who would he fight? And then, there's a lot of talk coming out that Ryan Bader is very close to signing with Bellator. He's a free agent at the moment. So outside of that particular fight, I don't know who else they could have probably matched him up with. Maybe a Glover Teixeira, but I don't know if he would be ready and willing and able to fight.
He's booked.
And yeah, actually, there you go. He's booked.
He's fighting Jared Cannonier.
There you go. So I thought, let me give him a call. So I spoke to Gustafsson earlier last week, and he told me himself, no interest in London. The date, he was being a little bit vague. He essentially, said that the date wouldn't fit his schedule in regards to making a comeback, and the right fight options weren't available, right? But he said he's looking at dates further afield from March 18th, right? So Gustafsson's going to be back probably sometime in April or May, and I think the UFC just need to figure out a fight that makes sense for him to keep him busy and to kind of I suppose keep him appeased in regards to something that will get him to a title shot again. So when that happened, I thought, right, okay, well, I really don't know what they're going to do now. And then Francis Ngannou got a massive win over the weekend. And again, we spoke about it earlier on the show. I thought, okay, well, he's come away pretty much unscathed here. Could they potentially match him up against a Ben Rothwell, a Stefan Struve, another heavyweight? And I'm sure, given the landscape, the MMA fans in the UK, fans that had already bought tickets, would understandably, still be maybe a little bit upset, but could maybe accept that, given the fact that Ngannou had just come off a massive win over the weekend. So he's hot right now, right? And then last night, the news broke, like you said. Mike Bond, my colleague over at MMA Junkie, broke the news. And first of all, I'm made up for Jimmy Manuwa. London zone, really happy for him. I'm sure both for him and for Corey Anderson, this probably, I'm guessing, means a bump up in pay to take a 5-round fight in a main event slot. Manuwa's ranked number 5 now. He got a fantastic win in the back end of last year in Manchester, and that was a really big fight for him. To come back off a loss to Anthony Johnson and to knock out OSP the way he did, that was one of the highlight knockouts of 2016. So for him to get a main event slot is huge, because that could potentially, again, in a division that's pretty weak when you start looking at the overall landscape of the top 50 and 20 fighters, that could propel him into a potential title shot, or at least get him a little bit further afield, get him further up there. It's just he doesn't have the right dance partner, Si. A few years ago, him against Gustafsson, main event London, that's the right dance partner. Corey Anderson, for me, he just isn't the right dance partner, right? I feel sorry for fans that perhaps bought tickets thinking that the UFC would give them a bigger marquee main event. And I think the track record's been pretty good. Normally, the UFC, when it comes to the London event on the European circuit, this is the one they tend to deliver the most on, because London is the one that gets the most media attention. It's the capital city of England. It's got the biggest airport in the world. It's got numerous flights from all across Europe. So it allows a lot of accessibility for European fans to come over. London is also a destination city. You can spend a week here as a tourist, have some fun, whatnot. So when I looked at the card, and again, this wasn't plan A for the UFC. Like you said, Simon, they announced this fight a few weeks ago. If this was their plan A, they would have announced it as a main event a few weeks back, but they didn't. Now, what do you say to fans that have bought tickets? It's a tough one, because I always say, look, and it doesn't matter what kind of consumer you are. If you're buying a ticket for a football match, if you're buying a ticket for a concert, if you feel as though you're not getting your bang for your buck, or if you're getting screwed over with the product or the sport or the team or the club you support or whatever it is, you really have to almost protest with your pounds or your euros or your dollars. You have to, and I know it's a bit tough because the UFC just comes to London once a year, and sometimes they miss London altogether in a calendar year. But I think what this means and what this tells me is that the UFC brand is way bigger than any fighter. The consumers buy tickets here in London, and MMA fans based on the brand. The UFC is coming to town, right? And perhaps their expectations weren't met. And like you said, Simon, my social media today, all day long, has been 99% really negative in regards to fans being disgruntled at the lack of a marquee main event. Fans, being unhappy that they spent, £200, £300 and whatnot, wishing they can get a refund. I mean, I don't know what to say, really. It's just really, really unfortunate. But this is also the sign of the times, not just here in London, in England, and in Europe. This has happened before. It's happened in Canada. It's happened in Brazil. The UFC has already cancelled a couple of shows this year, right? The star power across the board just isn't there right now with the UFC. They don't have a lot of guys are being tied up because they've been stacking up pay-per-views over the last 6 months with 2 title fights, right? So I don't know, and it's a UFC Fight Pass card to top it all off, So I don't know if that answers the question or if it gives me, has allowed me to express my feeling. I've just tried to, hit as many points as I possibly can. But what was your take, Simon? And what are your feelings in regards to the main event?
I'm disappointed for the fans who bought the tickets expecting another fight to be added at the top of the card, because that obviously isn't the case. I think if you look at the fights that are on the card right now, we've got 11 confirmed fights. 9 of those fights contain either a British or Irish fighter. So there's an awful lot of local talent involved in the card, which I think is a positive. There are people among the fan base, and some people have tweeted me, who have actually complained that it's the same old faces. But I think it's understandable that when there's a fight card in Britain, the British fighters are going to want to be on that card. They're the easiest ones to recruit for the card. They will also sell more tickets because they've got friends and family. It's common sense that you're going to pack a British card with British fighters, particularly when the UFC doesn't come to the UK that often. If we're lucky, we'll get a couple of shows, maybe 2, maybe 3. If we're really lucky, 3 in a calendar year, but they won't all be in the southeast of England. We might get one in Ireland if we're lucky, or we might get one in the north of England or in Scotland or wherever. So everything's going to be spread around. So the question comes when they announce the event and they start putting the fights on the card. You look at it and you say, "Oh, great! Brad Pickett's going to have his retirement fight. I want to be there for that." Jimmy Manuwa's got a tough fight against Corey Anderson. If he wins that, he's potentially going to put himself one step closer to a title shot. Maybe gets him in a number 1 contender shot. Maybe. And then you've got, people will have their domestic favourites, people they've watched come up through the ranks. People like Mark Diakiese, Tom Breese, Scott Askham in particular is a great example because he has a great amount of travelling support. Even when he was fighting in Germany, he brought hundreds and hundreds of fans with him. He'll have a huge travelling support in London. Joseph Duffy is a hugely popular fighter as well on this side of the pond. He makes what might be his final UFC appearance against Reza Madadi. So, there's an awful lot of intrigue on this card, in my opinion. Tom Breese is making his middleweight debut. Bradley Scott is taking on Scott Askham in a battle of Britain. Leon Edwards has got Vicente Luque. That fight's got Fight of the Night written all over it for me. They're 2 superb prospects at welterweight. I think that's a great fight. There's some decent fight, and Arnold Allen, Makwan Amirkhani, we know both of those guys well. That's going to be a good fight. So, the fights on paper are all good, decent matchups. What they just needed was a little sprinkling of stardust at the very top of the card for people to say, this is a really, really cool card. Bearing in mind it is a UFC Fight Pass card. We weren't going to get a World Championship fight. And anyone expecting a World Championship fight is kidding themselves. I know someone said, but we got Anderson Silva and Michael Bisping last year. We were lucky. We got Anderson Silva and Michael Bisping last year. People were complaining that it was going to be Michael Bisping versus Gegard Mousasi. I think people would be delighted with Michael Bisping, Gegard Mousasi right now, championship or not. So I'm completely with you on this as well in terms of with Jimmy in particular. Jimmy has paid his dues and has gone about his career in the right way. He didn't just jump in the UFC at the first opportunity. He turned them down twice because he was aware enough of his own abilities at the time to know that he wasn't ready. Incredibly mature and confident in his own ability that he knew that he would eventually reach the level where he could step in and do well. And he's found his feet in the UFC. He's been very unlucky with the way some of his fights have finished. In terms of the ones he's won, he hadn't had that highlight reel knockout. And then against OSP, he got it. And it was one of the most brutal finishes of 2016. And I think he should be. I think people should be happy for Jimmy that he's got the main event slot. But I do understand those fans who bought tickets knowing these fights were on the card, but expecting a main event to be added on top. So, but I wouldn't go as far as to say this is a bad card. Far from it. It's not a bad card. It just doesn't have the international superstar power at the top of it. I think you stick even if you put a Francis Ngannou versus Ben Rothwell fight on the top of that card, I think people would be pretty happy with that. Or at least they should be, I think. The other fights that I heard have been in the mix for this, you mentioned Gustafsson. I believe he was offered Misha Serkinov for this card, which would have been a very interesting fight. That I understand he got offered Misha Serkinov and he didn't want it. I can understand why you wouldn't want that as your comeback fight, because Misha Serkinov is absolutely terrifying, and if you've had a big layoff, fighting a big old tank of a man like that probably isn't the sort of fight you want to come back to. And if it doesn't fit your time frame or whatever, then fine. So if the Bader fight's off the table because of Bellator and the Serkinov fight gets turned down, then that rules Gustafsson out. Another fight that I heard had been linked, not necessarily a main event, but you could kind of crowbar it as a main event maybe. Mehmet Tizimov has gone public on this, that he was all set to fight Anthony Showtime Pettis, and Pettis for whatever reason has not signed the contract. So, and it was certainly it was implied that fight may well have been for London. So Mehmet Tizimov versus isn't an A-list star, but for those who've seen him fight know that he's legit. Anthony Showtime Pettis is a star. So maybe they could have put him in maybe as a co-main or a main, but it's really difficult. It's really difficult. There aren't that many obvious matchups you can make. And with it being a Fight Pass card, the star power, unfortunately, is going to be utilised elsewhere, where it's going to make the UFC more money. And that's the thing. They can spread themselves thinly if they want. But what seems to work for the UFC is when they stack the deck a little bit, and they're almost prepared to sort of, I hesitate to use the word neglect, that's not the right word, but put on less star-heavy cards in other areas so that they can stack the deck a little bit more for pay-per-views, which is obviously their core business. So I'm looking forward to the fights that are on the card. I'm not going to lie, I'm disappointed that there isn't a big main event to put on the top of it. Who knows, maybe they'll pull a rabbit from the hat and announce one. We weren't expecting Silva versus Bisping, were we? And then that came out of nowhere. So, but I suspect this is what we're going to get. I suspect we'll maybe get a co-main event slotted in, and maybe one other fight, because we're normally on 12 or 13 fights for a Fight Pass card. But I think it's a decent fight card, but I can understand why people are a bit disappointed for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and like you said, Simon, there are still a couple of spots left to take up on the fight card. There's usually, UFC events usually have 12 or 13 fights on the fight card. And who knows, I'm still kind of quietly hoping, that Francis Ngannou can get the clearance. Hopefully he didn't come away with any serious injuries there over the weekend. And the fact that he'd be able to fight in London, a stone's throw away from France. I'm sure he'll have a lot of supporters that could just get the Eurostar over to London for the weekend and watch their fellow countrymen fight, considering they can't see any legal MMA action in their own country. And I know that James Elliott was doing a lot of work over the last couple of days in France. I'm sure he's trying to do all he can to try and help push the regulation through, speak to the right people in government there, and do what needs to be done on the political side to try and get MMA legalized in France, because that could potentially be a huge market for them, down the road in the future, especially like I said with somebody like Ngannou. But coming back to the London card, look, I sympathise with anyone that's bought a ticket. If you're upset, I feel your pain, and to be honest with you, I don't want to speak on their behalf, but I've got a good feeling in saying that I'm sure the UFC London team would have wanted a lot more for this card too. They're not the ones that make the fights. They are always pushing for the absolute best fights possible for the European events. These decisions are made in Las Vegas by Dana White, Sean Shelby, and Mick Maynard. Those are the guys that figure out what fights need to be put on what cards. And like you said, Simon, as things currently stand, pay-per-view is king, more so than ever, especially without the likes of a Conor McGregor on a hiatus, without knowing when Ronda Rousey will actually make her return. They had a potential superstar on their hands in the making in Chris Cyborg, but unfortunately she's out. John Jones is suspended until the summer. Brock Lesnar, even though it was meant to be a one and done, even the option of him returning is off the table until the summer. George St. Pierre, who knows when he's going to potentially come back? He's at odds with the UFC about getting the right deal done. So, they need their champions. They need any stars they can get a hold of to headline and really stack these pay-per-views like they're doing with UFC 209. And the byproduct of that potentially will be, Fight Pass cards or Fox cards or Fight Night cards, either being cancelled, like we've seen a few times, like I mentioned this year, Simon, or perhaps not getting star power that that the local market and the local fans want. But this is also perhaps a statement on the number of fight cards that the UFC does put on every year. They put on about 40 42 events every year. That's a big number considering, like I said, drawing power, stars, and marquee fighters. So yeah, look, hopefully this time next week, Simon, when you and me are catching up again on the show, we've got a couple of more mouth-watering, juicy, exciting fights to discuss and talk about. But I'm really happy for Jimmy, like I said. I think he's got a monkey on his back, and I think that's a storyline for him coming back to the O2 Arena and fighting in the main event slot. He didn't get the job done a few years ago, and I think being a Londoner and having a lot of fans and friends and family there to watch him compete top of the bill against Gustafsson and losing in the fashion that he did, I'm sure he thinks about that a lot. Even though he's training with him now at the All-Star Gym in Stockholm, I think he wants to right that wrong and get a victory in the O2 Arena in the main event. And so I'm really happy and excited for him.
Absolutely, and we will obviously bring you any more news of additions to that fight card on next week's edition of the Brit Pack. Now, very, very quickly, we do have an event this coming weekend, February the 4th. The Toyota Center in Houston, Texas, plays host to UFC Fight Night. Bermudez versus the Korean Zombie. You're a bit of a star if you don't even need to have your real name on the poster. Chan Sung Jung, as his mum and dad called him, is back in the UFC, and he's straight in to a UFC main event. He takes on Dennis the Menace Bermudez. I'm looking forward to this fight at featherweight. Chan Sung Jung was the man. He was absolutely superb. Just a hell for leather performer. Always brought the action and the entertainment. as does Bermudez. That one will do the business on Fight Night. We'll quickly run down the key fights. Alexa Grasso takes on Felice Herrig at strawweight in the co-main. Abel Trujillo, James Vick at lightweight. OSP takes on Volkan Ozdemir, who is a replacement for Jan Blachowicz. Who else have we got? The opening fight on the main card should be an absolute cracker. Jessica Andrade takes on the returning Angela Hill, who jumps back into the UFC as the Invicta strawweight world champion, of course. And a fight or two fights on the prelim card to look out for. The first fight on the prelim card, Tisha Torres versus Beck Rawlins, should be a decent scrap at women's strawweight. And the featured preliminary bout, two heavyweight prospects, Adam Milstead and Curtis Blades. Blades had a tough start to his UFC career because they put him in with Francis Ngannou. But he was pretty much undefeated, I think, before then. So he's looking to find his feet. Adam Milstead is another guy who he's shown a little bit of promise as well. So that'll be one to watch as well. That's UFC on Fight Night this coming weekend. The numbers, if you're keeping up with it, is UFC Fight Night 104. And that one takes place February the 4th in Houston, Texas. Now, the reason why we whiz through those, Sandhu, is because we put the call out for questions this week and we got a bucket load. So let's just dive straight in and get as many as we can done before we wrap this thing up.
Yeah, absolutely. No shortage of questions this week. Normally, I think I've got to send a few prompts out on a Monday, but it just took one tweet at lunchtime and I was flooded with questions. Thank you, everyone, for tweeting. And remember, it's the Brit Pack MMA. That is the Twitter handle. Give us a follow and use that handle when you want to throw a question throughout the week, and we'll try and get it squeezed on into the Q&A segment on the show. So without further ado, the MMA Manor tweets in and says, who should Ngannou face next? I like a fight with Derek Lewis. We quickly spoke about this earlier on the show. You mentioned Ben Rothwell. I wouldn't mind the Stefan Struve fight, an all-European clash. But outside of those, are there any other fights that you think make sense for the newer superstar in the heavyweight division?
Not right now. I think a lot of the names who you would potentially like to see him against are all tied up in fights. So I think Struve and Rothwell are the two highest ranked available fights for him. Derek Lewis is just coming off a recent win, so he may potentially be available if they're not in a rush to put Ngannou back in there. That would be quite a sight to see those two guys. We saw both of those two in Zagreb. I remember Media Day. They were both sat at the end of the same row, and they were like the two biggest bookends you've ever seen. They're two huge hulking guys, and I'm sure their paths will cross at some point. They're both on the way up. I would probably keep them apart at this stage, though. I think the Rothwell fight makes the most sense to me. I think Ben Rothwell needs a fight against a notable opponent to propel himself back in there, and Francis Ngannou needs a name and a credible contender. I think in terms of where they are for their careers, I think Rothwell is probably the best pick. So he would be my selection.
Nice one. Amir tweets in and says, thoughts on Cowboy and his run at welterweight. Do you feel him fighting as often as he does caused the loss? That's a really good question, and it's something I've actually thought about. You know, Cowboy Cerrone is one of those fighters that likes to fight as consistently and as often as possible. You know, sometimes I feel like that could be it could be a pro and a con. You know, if you're fighting as often as he does and you're not getting any serious injuries, you're keeping your skill set very, very sharp, right? But at the same time, the counter to that is, are you giving yourself and your body enough time to recover, not just from the fight, but the 6, 8, 10, 12 week camps that these fighters usually put in for these fights. What's your general thoughts on that, Simon, in terms of fighting consistently, fighting often, and knowing when to say no to let your body heal up and so forth?
It's hard to know just what the effect is. I mean, all I know from looking down his recent record is that the turnaround time between the two fights it looks to be, from my very quick and probably very poor mental arithmetic, the shortest turnaround he's had since he fought twice in a fortnight back in January 2015, which is ridiculous. He fought Miles Jury on January the 3rd, and then he beat him, and then he beat Benson Henderson on January the 18th. That's ridiculous behaviour, but he got away with it because he won both those fights. This time around, he fought December 10th against Matt Brown. You don't go through a fight with Matt Brown without getting hit. So he would have taken some shots in that fight. He knocked him out in the 3rd round. So, he would have had to negotiate 10 minutes of Matt Brown punishment before he could eventually land that head kick and win the fight. How much of that had an effect on him against Masvidal? I don't know. I mean, he's fighting at a weight class where he's obviously going to be healthier. He's going to be better hydrated, and compared to when he was at 155 at least. So it's a difficult one. I know Dana referenced it in a press conference, saying when he wants to fight this many times, it's going to catch up with him and stuff like this. I just think Masvidal was the better guy on the night. I understand why people want to make excuses or try and find a reason for Cerrone losing, because he was on such a great run of form. I think that detracts from what Jorge Masvidal did. I think it was more because of his performance rather than Cerrone's turnaround time or anything else. I would lay the blame, if you're going to put the blame anywhere, for Cerrone losing that fight. I would lay that blame firmly at the feet of Jorge Masvidal, who put on the best performance of his career. So, sometimes you don't need to find what's wrong. Sometimes you just come up against the better guy on the night. And Masvidal was undoubtedly the better guy on the night.
Daryl Chumbley tweets in and says, would additional weight classes be beneficial for MMA? 15 to 20 pounds is a big jump in weight, especially from 155 to 170 pounds. Is 10% extra? I actually agree with this, and I've actually been a big fan of this idea of perhaps creating a 165 pound weight class and a 175 pound weight class, so that you're getting incremental jumps up of 10 pounds throughout the various weight classes. And I think there's enough fighters in the lightweight and welterweight division to actually create a new division in between, where you've got like 155 pound fighters that are just cutting way too much weight, and you've got 170 pound fighters that are undersized for the weight class. I mean, could you imagine if there was a 175 pound welterweight class? How amazing it would be for Johnny Hendricks and Kelvin Gastelum, right? So I like the idea, and I think if the UFC wants to create more belts, instead of creating interim titles, why not create an actual division where you can have fresh matchups, new stars emerging, and an actual weight class that makes a lot of sense. Your thoughts, Simon?
Yeah, I think the big barrier to that is the number of bodies you have, and do you have enough people to justify creating a weight class? Now, they've just created a 145 pound women's weight class, and they currently have 2 fighters in that weight class. So the answer to that, is if they can do it for that, then they can do it for any weight class. Totally agree about the having the 10 pound jumps. I think all the way from flyweight all the way up to light heavyweight, you should have 10 pound gaps. So I'd have a 195 weight class. Then you got 205, and then I'd jump 20 pounds. Have a 225 weight class for like super. What do you call it? Cruiserweight. And then you have super heavyweight for the big boys, 225 and above. But I think in order to do, in some ways, it kind of fits with what we've been talking about in recent shows about the UFC needs to create more stars. They need to, if they want to put championship belts at the top of these big cards, and at times you get the impression they're struggling to do so, which is why we've seen some of these interim titles suddenly cropping up. Why not create these other opportunities? It means more fighters are in more meaningful matchups. Because you're not just talking about the championship fights, you've got number one contender fights. And it increases your permutations for, the matchmakers when they're sitting down and saying, right, okay, what can we do here? And you've got the instance where you've got fighters who can operate in more than one weight class. And I think it also encourages fighters to fight at a more natural weight. and but it also encourages fighters to sort of jump around a bit and try different weight classes and pursue whatever opportunities they can get. It opens up the opportunity for more champion versus champion matchups, and without muddying the waters too much, because I think you should only have one championship per weight class. That's one of the big selling points of the UFC. But having extra weight classes, I think, is fine, and I think it makes a lot of sense.
Craig Skyrm tweets in and actually took a screenshot because his question was quite lengthy, which is quite a clever way of doing it. I can't. And Francis Ngannou, I'm telling you, is a very popular fighter at the moment. Got quite a few questions thrown our way regarding the heavyweight. Anyway, so his question is: I can't see Francis Ngannou losing a fight anytime soon. I've just read about his background coming from Cameroon and had to emigrate to Paris. He is the first good African MMA heavyweight I've seen. Should the UFC think about doing the Ultimate Fighter Africa someday and try and open doors for that market and try and find talent? Yeah, sure, why not? They've done it in China, they've done it in Brazil, in Latin America. I know that there's, and the promotion from the top of my head escapes me, but there is a South African promotion site. Help me out here.
EFC.
There you go, EFC. They seem to be cultivating a lot of the African, or at least South African MMA talent, and there's lots of gyms in that part of Africa. Yeah, I mean it's a weird one because Africa is yet another massive potential market that the UFC hasn't really penetrated. They have the EMEA office, and EMEA stands for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. They've been to Europe a hell of a lot. They've been to Middle East with events in Dubai. They have not yet been to Africa with any event. And maybe it would take Francis Ngannou as a champion to help open those doors. He's from Cameroon. Maybe he can help make that happen. But I actually think for the time being, who knows, maybe some sort of relationship with EFC to cultivate talent to the UFC, much like how the UFC has a relationship with Cage Warriors, might be a better route for the time being. Simon, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think if you take a look at the UFC, I mean, I've spoken to UFC officials about this in the past and said, have you considered doing an event in South Africa in particular? Because there is a market down there for mixed martial arts. And I was told at the time that the exchange rate was a bit of a killer for the UFC. The cost of putting an event on down there would have been prohibitive. The other thing is, EFC, it's a little bit like the KSW situation in Poland. They've got such a strong brand down there, Extreme Fighting Championship. And if you go and look at any of their broadcasts, they don't just model themselves on the UFC. They've straight ripped off the UFC's presentation. If you go back to like the UFC sort of 5-6 years ago, the last time I watched an EFC broadcast, which admittedly was probably like 2 or 3 years ago, it looked almost identical. It looked almost virtually identical, as someone might say. But the big problem, and this is the problem you get with any emerging nation, is you need the talent to then jump up to world level and stick around. And so far, the only South African to really have had any measure of success in the UFC is Gareth McClellan, the Soldier Boy. And he's a real pathfinder for them. He's an excellent interview. He comes across really well. He's got a very distinctive look about him, which makes him instantly recognisable. As I say, and he comes across excellent with the media. But he's really been the only guy. Ruan Potts was a South African heavyweight, I think, who he had a couple of fights in the UFC. He really didn't. He really struggled at UFC level, and has since sort of disappeared. So that's where you've got the problem. In terms of local talent, they've probably got quite a competitive promotion down there. But the problem is, once you break it out of that market and you start putting some of those fighters in at world level, then you've got a huge gap. We saw it with the Ultimate Fighter China, and we thankfully on a sort of a topical note, Li Jingliang put in one of the best performances of the night on Saturday night. He's the one guy He's their guy right now from China who he's the standard bearer. He's made it across to the UFC and has managed to stick around, and he's now building his game, much as Gareth McClellan is trying to do the same for South Africa. But that's the problem you've got. So to create an Ultimate Fighter series and season will alert you to the product. But if those fighters then, or the winner then goes into the UFC and gets smashed, you've invested an awful lot of money and you've not got a hell of a lot out of it, because EFC have got such a strong footprint in the market. So that, I think, is why they haven't gone yet. And that is probably why they won't go for a little while. Unless they partner up with EFC and co-brand or do something, which typically they don't do. That would make a bit more sense if you put a couple of UFC fights on an EFC card and co-branded it a little bit. Maybe that would work. It sort of Trojan horses the UFC brand in South Africa a little bit. You build it gradually that way. But I can't see it happening for a little while yet.
Anthony W tweets in, and surprise, surprise, it's another question in relation to our man Francis Ngannou. Will France change its stance on MMA if Ngannou wins UFC Heavyweight Championship? I think they should definitely jump on this Ngannou bandwagon way before he potentially wins a championship. I think it's a fascinating story and probably really appropriate right now with what's happening in the world, where a guy from Cameroon immigrated to France, who opened their doors to him when he was just a kid, and he took the opportunity to make something of his life with opportunities in France. And but Francis Ngannou isn't the first French MMA fighter, and he certainly won't be the last. And France is a powerhouse in so many other sporting stages, whether it comes to football or tennis and Formula One. There's so many other sports that France has real world championship level athletes and competitors. Why not get behind MMA, especially when you've got a massive superstar in the making in Ngannou? Like I said, James Elliott, he's definitely putting in the work. The UFC are putting in the work. They want to break into the French market. We know they've been trying to do that for quite some time. But yeah, I think if you win the championship, that might speed things up a little bit. What do you think, Si?
Well, under normal circumstances, I would agree with you. But in the case of this particular situation, I don't think it will, because my understanding of the situation is this is less about sport and more about politics and the politics of sport. And there's a big issue in France with the perception of mixed martial arts, and a lot of the people in positions of influence within the sporting governance in France are heavily tied in with the French judo side of things, and some of the statements that have come from the leadership there on the French judo side have been from for someone on the mixed martial arts side of things, they've been laughable. They've been talking about it promoting terrorism and all sorts of stuff. It's been quite incredible stuff. The place to check out if you want any sort of further reading on this is IMAF, the International Mixed Martial Arts Federation. They have been working tirelessly to try and establish the sport of mixed martial arts over in France, and it's been a losing battle so far, and it's something that you just hope that eventually will happen. But it reminds me in some ways of the situation in New York, where you had people at the very top who, for whatever reason, had just turned themselves off to the sport, weren't prepared to listen to reason, weren't prepared to listen to sort of research, facts, any kind of argument of substance. Not interested. They've made their decision, they've made their minds up, and that's pretty much it. And it's a sorry state of affairs right now, and I'm by no means an expert on this topic, but that is my understanding of how things are right now. And maybe having a prominent champion like a Francis Ngannou, if he goes and becomes the world heavyweight champion, that will carry some serious clout, and at the very least, the level of interest from French sports fans will naturally increase because there's the baddest man on the planet happens to be someone who emigrated to France as a child and is now I think he's technically a French national now. I think he is.
I think so. Yeah.
So yeah, and naturally that will then start to sort of pique people's interest. But in terms of getting the ban overturned, there's a hell of a lot of diplomatic work and lobbying that needs to be going on, and the likes of Mark Ratner are probably gonna be sick of the place. I'm sure he's visited Paris on countless occasions in an attempt to try and break the walls down over there. The big barrier was New York before. Now it's France. Different situation, but there are certain similarities involved where it's as if people aren't listening to reason. And we've had it in Australia, in certain states of Australia, where they're happy to have MMA, but they refuse to have the cage. And that's purely because people don't like the aesthetic. That could be the only reason, because it's not, whenever I talk to people, and I remember where was I? I was in Glasgow for the ACB event, and we'd been to the fights, and I'm in the bar. Funny that. But I was in a bar, and this couple, I suppose they're in their mid to late 50s, and the lady started talking to me and asking me why, who all these big scary looking guys were, and I explained what had gone on, and then I ended up, what I thought was going to be like a polite 2-minute conversation ended up being a 45-minute diplomatic chat where I was trying to explain to them why mixed martial arts wasn't just a load of crazy meatheads just hurling fists at each other. And by the end of it, like, they were saying, but what about this? They fight in a cage, don't they? I'm like, well, you know why that is, don't you? And then you explain all this, and it's almost like the scales falling from the eyes. And like, I understand that now. And now, it takes two things to happen. It takes someone to explain, but it also requires the other side of the equation to be prepared to listen and to be prepared to take on board the information. And in France at the moment, that side of the party is just not there. The doors are shut. So I don't think we're going to see the UFC in France or professional MMA in France yet. I'd love to see it soon, but I don't think it's going to happen yet. They've got a lot of work to do to try and win them over.
Clearly, France are happy not to be the A side on this occasion.
There you go.
Stephen Murray tweets in and says, "Give me your dream UFC commentary lineup. Mine would be Joe Rogan and Bas Rutten." Well, for me, it is a dream scenario because this commentator is no longer commentating on any MMA fights anymore, and that's Mauro Ranallo, who is working for the WWE now. I've always wondered what it would be like to watch a UFC event with Joe Rogan and Mauro Ranallo. Just a two-man team, no three-man team, a two-man team. The two of them, Mauro Ranallo, obviously, having commentated, Pride and Strikeforce and Showtime Boxing and Pro Wrestling now with WWE, a true veteran and one of the good guys of the sport. It's been a pleasure to meet him on a few occasions, being on the road. But that's my pick, Si. Joe Rogan, Mauro Ranallo. What about you?
I'm going for Mauro as well. I think he's the best play-by-play guy in combat sport. And I know people are going to say, yeah, wrestling's not a combat sport. It's combat sports entertainment, so you're in a similar sphere. He also commentates on Showtime Boxing. So we had that amazing fight between Carl Frampton and Leo Santa Cruz at the weekend. That was another reason why I was up till silly o'clock. I watched that after everything else had finished. And he commentates on that for Showtime, and he's awesome. And obviously the Pride commentaries and all the rest of it. I would go for a three-man booth. And I would combine your suggestion with Stephen's suggestion. I would have Joe Rogan and Bas Rutten alongside the bipolar rock and roller, as he likes to call himself, Mauro Ranallo. I think the energy level that you would get coming through your TV set would be phenomenal. I think you'd have I think you'd have an awful amount of amusing moments as well. Baz is brilliant. Rogan's brilliant. And between the pair of them, I think you give them a couple of shows and they'll be absolutely flying. And I think people would... I think it would just add an extra dimension. Like I'm a huge fan of the guys that the UFC already has. John Anik's one of the nicest guys in the game. Works his socks off and is just the consummate professional. My buddy John Gooden does an incredible job. I'd like to see him get a few shows stateside. I think they'd really warm to him over there. And they're blessed with a load of great analysts. Dan Hardy's a great analyst. Dominic Cruz is a great analyst. Brian Stan is excellent. And Cormier's becoming quite entertaining as well. So they're blessed with a lot of options. But for me, Mauro Ranallo, Joe Rogan, Baz Rutten, book it. Get them on board for the big pay-per-view shows. I think that would be the dream ticket.
All right. Graham Hughes tweets in and says, have the UK fans been shortchanged with the London card? Is the Manua fight a worthy main event? Is it a worthy main event for London? Well, like I said, I think 50% of it is. I just don't think he's got the right dance partner. I mentioned that before. I think had he been given someone like a Ryan Bader or a Glover Teixeira or just someone that could really give him a not to say that Corey Anderson wouldn't give him a test, but Manu has main evented fight cards before. He's main evented London. He's coming off a ridiculously good knockout fight. I understand what some people mean in regards to Manua isn't exactly the Conor McGregor when it comes to his skills on the microphone, but he's a different kind of fighter in regards to how he conducts himself in interviews. Very serious. He, like you mentioned, Simon, is very mature. He's been around for a while. He pretty much lets his hands do the talking. But if you under the right circumstances, I think you can promote Manua really, really well. I think for this particular card, you got to really build up the hometown London boy story, the fact that he's got that monkey on his back at the moment, having lost in the main event a few years ago to Gustafsson. But coming back to the fight card, I think sometimes maybe in Europe we can be a little bit spoiled. I think we were spoiled last year twice with the Anderson Silva, Michael Bisping, Dan Henderson. We have to be realistic in this part of the world where the UFC in the sport is still very much a North American product for a North American audience. So if every now and then we get a pay-per-view, if every now and then we get a Michael Bisping fight, I think we should count our lucky stars. Because to be brutally honest, it's not a product that's really made for a European audience. If it was, we wouldn't be staying up until 4 or 5, 6 o'clock on most weekends watching it. Your thoughts on that, Simon?
Yeah, the thing that they need to try and sell in this fight, because Corey's not the biggest promo guy himself.
Yeah.
They just need to get hold. They need to ring up Dave O'Donnell, and they need to get his highlight reel from his Ultimate Challenge days. They need to get Jimmy Manua's highlight reel from his Ultimate Challenge days. And they need to tell the story of this guy. And they need to tell the story of the single most destructive puncher that this country has produced in mixed martial arts. Since I've been covering it in the last 8 years or so, there isn't anybody who comes close. He's just a devastating striker. And he's transitioned to the UFC. He's had to fight more well-rounded opponents, people who are prepared to try and take him into deep water. And he's been in there with some of the very best in the world, and he hasn't always come out on the right side of it, but he's learnt from that and he's come back. And now he's headlining in his own hometown. And I think that's a great story. And I think showing that this is a guy who has been unlucky not to have had the big highlight reel moment in the UFC, having arrived in the UFC on this sea of knockouts, and then finally in one of the biggest fights of his career against a former interim title challenger in Ovince Prue, who went the distance with John Jones with a broken arm. OSP went the distance with John Jones with a broken arm. Manua destroyed him. Absolutely destroyed him. And that performance, you just need to keep showing that performance. Show what he did to Carl Kingsbury. just the array of punishing strikes that guy can actually deliver, and maybe try and get hold of some of his early fight footage and tell the guy's story. Have we been shortchanged as a country? I don't know if we've been shortchanged. I think this is an example of what's happening now with the UFC. Whereas before they were able to really push and put on fight cards that, yeah, most of the time they were kind of local, but we still had a sizable main event featuring international stars of some description. What's happening now is WME IMG are now focusing much more, I think, on the pay-per-view side of the business, especially when you think their two biggest drawing stars are out of the equation. So that just means they've got to spread themselves even thinner. So, and I think the Fight Pass cards are the ones that are going to get hit the hardest, and this is a Fight Pass card. This is the reality of it. This fight could be happening in Canada. This fight card could be happening in Brazil, and it would be very similar. They'd pack it with Canadian talent, and it might not have a stellar main event. They could pack it with Brazilian talent, and it might not have a stellar main event. What we have here is a card packed with British talent, and it might not be your A-list main event that you're hoping for, but it is one of the most spectacular strikers that this country's produced in the sphere of MMA. So I think we need to take it on face value, and take it in isolation and look at it and go, what have we actually got here? And I think what we've got is a collection of entertaining fights. If you want A-list fights, you've got to get on a plane. I think that's in the main, that's how it works, because as you say, it's a North American product. We were lucky last year, and I think we showed that we're a market that can accommodate that sort of event, and hopefully we will again. But right now, this is a Fight Pass show, and we're getting a Fight Pass card. So I think we need to understand that a little bit.
And also, just to kind of add to that a little bit, I think we're quite lucky and have been quite lucky in the UK over the years of the amount of UFC events we've got, considering how many European countries there are where MMA is legal, and these countries have been crying for the UFC to come, and the UFC haven't yet. But yet, typically, we always get one or two events within the UK. Last year, we got 3 in Belfast, Manchester, and London. So very, very lucky. Can't complain too much. And the other thing I want to say is, look, if you can get tickets, and if you've never been to a UFC event before or to an MMA event before, if you've perhaps got some friends that have never been before, these are the type of events that where, if you could grab a ticket for 30, 40 quid or 50 quid, and that's, I suppose, pretty affordable. It's decent just to go along to check out the experience, because the UFC do put on the bells and whistles. It will be a Fight Pass card, so there won't be any lag between the fights. It will be fight after fight after fight, and it is a good night out if you haven't been to a UFC event before. They do put a lot of effort in the overall production of things. So, I don't think we've been shortchanged. I think rather the opposite. If you factor in how much UFC product and events we've had over the years, we've been quite lucky. Right, so moving on, James says, how shocked are you that the fights at the top of the UFC London card are nothing like what you guys predicted a few weeks ago? Well, if you James, appreciate the tweet. It's not the first time, and it probably won't be the last time when me and Simon try and predict something in the world of MMA and get it horribly, horribly wrong.
Oh yeah, and it doesn't just apply to MMA either. For someone that used to sideline as a betting tipster, things have not gone well for me in the last few. I predicted Juliana Pena would win. That didn't happen. I wrote a piece about the Royal Rumble. 4 men to look out for in the Royal Rumble. Not a single one of them showed up. So this is the kind of situation we're in here. But I think the other thing that we have to hold our hands up to when we talk about the UFC and events, particularly when they're happening in our own backyard, there is a tinge of hope when we talk about these things as well. And we have to be honest about this. We look at things, and I certainly am. I'm a born optimist, and you look at situations and you think, yeah, that could work, and you look at reasons why things can work. And I think the Gegard Mousasi situation made an awful lot of sense. And when they booked that fight for Buffalo, it was a bit of a kick in the nuts. It was like, okay. So we're not going to get the big main event that we were hoping for, because after that, and we've spoken about it earlier in the show, you're kind of scrambling around a little bit looking for something, and they obviously couldn't find what they wanted because they eventually decided to bump Jimmy and Corey up to the main event. The one thing I would say about all of this is as British MMA fans, I think it's important that we, as well as we want to see the best product we can in this country, and I completely get that, and I understand that. And when you're forking out money for tickets, you want to see the best product possible. But I also think it's important that while people are going to be disappointed, and that's understandable, this is also a huge opportunity for a British fighter. And I think while it's okay to be disappointed, I think it's also okay to be excited for the guy who's getting the unexpected opportunity. And there's a balance in that, because I'm not going to lie, I'm disappointed. I'm very disappointed. But I'm also absolutely pumped for Jimmy. And, it's a great opportunity for him. And I hope that he's able to take full advantage of it against a very, very difficult opponent stylistically for him. So, I'm not someone who will ever turn around and slam a fight card, because I want to watch good fights. I don't, yes, you want to see the names, but sometimes the names aren't the people that deliver the best fights. So I think this could deliver a host of great fights. And there's a lot of local interest in there. Yeah, we'd have liked a big headliner on top, but I don't think that's reason to slam the rest of the card for it. So that's all I would say. I've seen some people just going to town on the fight card and slagging it off, where these are professional fighters, and a lot of them are fighting for you guys in the UK and us guys, and I think they deserve a little bit more respect than to be told that they're on a fight card that sucks. So that's just a little side note.
Well said. Next question comes in from Blue Nose Greig MMA, who says, "Why is it the media, fans, and Dana always take Conor comments so literally? It's an act. Surely that's clear." Well, look, sometimes you've got to take what Conor McGregor says with a pinch of salt. But like you said, Simon, John Morgan said on his podcast the last couple of days that an Instagram post and the article related to that Instagram post did more traffic than the entire play-by-play for UFC on Fox 23. Listen, Conor McGregor is a draw. People are interested in what he has to say, what he has to tweet, what he wants to post on Instagram and whatnot. And we're just the conduit for him to say what he wants and to get that out there to the wider public, whether it's our MMA bubble or to a mainstream audience. Now, if you're a part of our hardcore community, I think you can see the forest from the trees, and you can make out what comments have some meat to the bones, and what comments McGregor makes are just for some headlines, which and he's got zingers galore. But what's your take, Simon, in regards to Blue Nose Greig MMA's questions? Do you think Dana and the media, fans take Conor comments a little bit too literally?
I don't, but I think the other thing to bear in mind is, and I studied this at school, it's sort of the sociology of the media, and there's different schools of thought. One is that the media are influencing the outside world by what they publish, and then there's the opposing angle, that the outside world is influencing what the media publishes. And the truth of the matter is, if Conor McGregor generated no interest, if you published a Conor McGregor story and no one was interested in it, you wouldn't be writing about Conor McGregor every day. I've just left the Sun, and you look on their MMA section, you're not going to find an awful lot of proper sports reporting on there, because that's not what's doing the numbers for them right now. They've decided that what we want is Conor McGregor stories. And I don't care whether it's about him fighting, whether it's about him shopping, whether it's about him going to a wedding, whatever it is, if it's got his name on it, they've looked at the analytics and said, this guy clicks, whatever he does, write a story on it. And that's what's happening. And there's a balance to be struck. If you're a proper sports outlet, I think there's a duty to report the sports side of things and push that angle. But there's also a bit of leeway and a bit of room to do some of the colour stuff around it. And that's where I think there needs to be a balance struck. Some outlets will go gung-ho for one. Some will completely ignore that and just go with the straight sports angle. I think reality is somewhere between the two. You need a mix of both. And I think the situation with Conor is, if no one was interested, no one would be writing about it. I think most people know that he's playing a game. But the thing is, it's an entertaining game to watch. You know, that's why people love Prince Nassim Hamed. That's why people used to love watching Chris Eubank. That's why people love professional wrestling. These guys get into a ring and pretend to beat the living daylights out of each other for 10, 20, 30, 40 minutes. But they'll be driving in the same car to the next show, buying cups of coffee and donuts at drive-bys and sharing petrol money. Because they're selling you something. They're selling you a product. And these fighters, like Conor McGregor, are selling you a product. They're selling you the overall package. The difference with professional fighting is all of that fades away when they step into the cage or in the boxing ring and they fight. And that's where it all gets settled. And I think some people like that side of the sport where there's all the salesmanship. Some people really don't. But the good thing about it is, whether you like it or you don't, eventually you see them fight. And it takes us back to the very first, one of the first things we were talking about Conor. I just want to see the guy fight. That's it. And hopefully we will eventually.
Well, I think this has been one of our longest podcasts ever, clocking at well over 2 hours. But we do have one final question. And that comes from Ryan Thomas MMA, who says, was Bellator 171 necessary? Card was poor. Could have gone from 170 to 172 and kept the higher standard. So, honestly, I don't watch 171. Probably because we don't get it here in the UK live. That's a big part of it. But there was also a lot of other action going on over the weekend. We talked about Bellator 170 last weekend, Simon, which was a massive event for the promotion, one of their tentpole events. And 172 coming up in about 3 weeks from now is also a big tentpole event when you've got Fedor Emelianenko versus Matt Mitrione. That should do pretty well on Spike over in the US. I've literally just typed in Bellator 171 on Wikipedia. Chidi Njokuani beat Melvin Gillard in what ended up being a 180-pound catchweight. And the only couple of other notable victories that I think stand out to me are David Rickles beating Aaron Darrow by TKO, and AJ McKee, who's a big prospect for Bellator, beating Brandon Phillips by unanimous decision. Now, I believe that Bellator 172 will be airing this upcoming Saturday on Spike UK for anyone here in the UK that wants to check that out. There's usually a 1 week delay on stateside Bellator MMA events being broadcast here over in the UK. And yeah, maybe it is a fair criticism that maybe Bellator should just focus on these tentpole events, but they're certainly not doing as many events as the UFC. On the one side, I think they're having major success with these tentpole events, and on the other side, there will be some of these filler events, but they've got to put them somewhere. Did you check out Bellator 171, or did you check out any of the results, Simon? And if so, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I didn't check out the event. Obviously, getting hold of Bellator footage in the UK, you need to be a little bit resourceful in order to get hold of some of this stuff. AJ McKee is the name that leaps off the paper. He's the prospect who I'm interested to see just where the ceiling is for him. He looks like a real talent, and he's moving his way up that featherweight division. And I expect that they'll soon have him on one of those big tentpole cards in a supporting role. And obviously the next event is 172, which is a tentpole event. You've got Fedor versus Matt Mitrione, Josh Thompson, Patricky Pitbull Freire, Chet Congo, Ollie Thompson, Britain's own Ollie Thompson taking on Chet Congo in that main card. So that's coming up. I understand why they need to put these events on, and there's a lot of fights. A 14-fight card, that was a 14-fight card in Kansas City. Now, there's no information here about attendance and gate or anything like that, but if they pack that arena, or they put a few thousand in that arena, and they sold enough merchandise, and they sold enough tickets and all the rest of it, then that's a commercial success, and it gives those fighters a chance to build up their records and progress in their respective weight divisions to earn their spot on one of those tentpole shows. So you do need to have it. It's like having the Premier League with none of the Football League underneath. It just doesn't work. You need the structure beneath. You need a way of feeding the talent through. So I think you do need shows like these. They might not necessarily be the sexiest shows to watch. They might not be the ones that you stay up till stupid o'clock in the morning to watch, like we often do. But they are a means to an end, and I think they do serve a purpose for Scott Coker and Bellator, because they're going to produce, hopefully, the next wave of talent. And if they don't have those sorts of shows, then how are they going to grow? So I think these shows, they're not sexy, but I think they are important for the growth of the brand and the growth of the promotion.
That's a wrap, Simon. That is all the questions for this week.
Nice one. Yeah, we've just tipped past the 2-hour mark. Thank you so much for sticking with us if you did. We had a few rambling monologues on that one, but lots to talk about, whether it was Conor McGregor or the UFC London card. Lots of important MMA related issues to people on this side of the pond. So thank you so much for all your questions as well. We really do appreciate them. If we did somehow miss your question, then please do tweet them again. I know Stephen Murray, for example, it took him a couple of goes before he got his question on. We got it answered, Steve. We got it answered. So we do try and pay attention and get all of your questions in wherever we can. Of course, you can subscribe to the show. We would love that very much. Go to iTunes. You can go to SoundCloud. You can go to Stitcher. And you can go to Acast. Best way to find all of this stuff is on our website, thebritpackmma.com. You can follow us on Twitter at thebritpackmma. You can follow Sandhu at Sandhu MMA, and you can follow me at Simon Head. That, Mr. Sandhu, was show number 25. We've done the quarter century. We've somehow survived, and we will be back next week with number 26 as we look back at UFC Fight Night and the return of the Korean Zombie as he takes on the menace Dennis Bermudez. Until then, enjoy the fights, and we'll speak to you next week.